Like a lot of people who grew up hearing about Alaska in the 1970s and 80s, I was fascinated by the idea of the last frontier. It seemed like a place where rugged individualists could make their own way, where the wilderness was vast and untamed, and where a person could disappear into the landscape and become whoever they wanted to be. For most people, Alaska represented freedom and adventure. But as anyone who has studied the darker side of Alaskan history knows, that same isolation and anonymity that attracted dreamers also provided the perfect hunting ground for predators. The vast wilderness that promised liberation for some became a killing field for others, and the very remoteness that made Alaska appealing also made it incredibly dangerous for those who fell into the wrong hands. Some very disturbing crimes went down in Alaska during this era, with perpetrators operating for years without detection, taking advantage of the sparse population and limited law enforcement resources. And Robert Hansen seemed like the most ordinary guy you could imagine. He was a quiet baker who ran Hansen Bakery in downtown Anchorage, a soft-spoken family man with a wife and 2 kids who lived in a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. He had thinning hair, thick glasses, and the kind of unremarkable appearance that made him blend into any crowd. To his customers, he was just the guy who made their morning pastries and wedding cakes. He stuttered when he spoke and seemed almost painfully shy around women. What do you know? This harmless-looking baker was one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history, and the wilderness of Alaska was his personal hunting preserve. I think it helped that Hansen had grown up as an outcast. He had been mercilessly bullied in school for his severe acne, his stutter, and his awkward social skills. Kids had called him names, excluded him from groups, and made his teenage years a living nightmare. But he had found solace in 2 activities that would later become integral to his crimes. He was an expert marksman and an experienced hunter who knew the Alaskan wilderness like the back of his hand. He could track game through the most remote areas, and his skill with a rifle was legendary among local hunting enthusiasts. One victim who survived Hansen's twisted game was a 17-year-old girl I will call Cindy. She had been working as an exotic dancer at a club downtown when Hansen approached her one evening in June of 1983. He seemed different from the usual customers, quieter and more polite, and when he offered to pay her for private time at his house, she agreed. It was a decision that nearly cost her life and would haunt her for decades to come. Hansen took Cindy to his home in the Muldoon area, while his wife and children were visiting relatives in the lower 48. The house was modest but well-maintained, filled with hunting trophies and photographs of Hansen posing with various kills. Mounted deer heads stared down from the walls, and glass cases displayed his extensive collection of hunting rifles. Cindy noticed his hands shaking as he poured her a drink, and his stutter seemed more pronounced than usual. She had been around nervous men before and did not think much of it at first, but Hansen had not brought her there for the reasons she expected. After she finished her drink, he produced a pair of handcuffs and told her in his halting, stuttering voice that they were going to play a game. When Cindy refused and tried to leave, Hansen grabbed a hunting knife from his collection and held it to her throat. His entire demeanor changed in that moment. The shy, stammering baker disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. He forced the handcuffs on her wrists and dragged her to his basement, where she discovered the true horror of what Hansen had been doing. The basement was a makeshift prison filled with items that belonged to other women. There were purses, jewelry, pieces of clothing, and photographs that Hansen had taken of his victims. Some of the photos showed women in various states of terror and distress, and Cindy realized with growing horror that she was looking at evidence of multiple murders. Hansen told her matter-of-factly that she was going to die, but first they were going to take a little trip into the wilderness where she would have a chance to run for her life. Hansen explained his twisted game with the casual tone of someone describing a weekend fishing trip. He would fly his victims out to a remote area in his small plane, give them a head start, and then hunt them down like wild animals. He had been doing this for years, he told her, and had perfected the technique. The women never escaped because there was nowhere to run in the vast Alaskan wilderness, and even if they somehow evaded him, they would die of exposure or starvation. It was the ultimate hunt, he said, and the ultimate proof of his superiority over those who had mocked and rejected him. The next morning, Hansen loaded Cindy into his car and drove to Merrill Field, where he kept his Piper Super Cub. She was still handcuffed and had a chain around her ankles that allowed her to walk, but not run. Hansen seemed almost cheerful as he prepared the plane, whistling softly and checking the engine with the same care he brought to his baking. He told Cindy about some of his previous hunts, describing in detail how long each woman had lasted and how he had finally tracked them down. Some had tried to hide, others had attempted to fight back, but all had eventually fallen to his rifle. As they flew over the endless expanse of wilderness south of Anchorage, Hansen pointed out landmarks and explained the terrain below. He knew every valley, every creek, and every possible shelter where a desperate person might try to hide. He had hunted this area for decades and had cached supplies and weapons throughout the region. There was no escape, he assured her, but if she provided good sport, he might make her death quick and merciful. Hansen landed the plane on a sandbar beside the Nick River, in an area so remote that no one would hear her screams or find her body for years, if ever. He unchained her ankles but left the handcuffs on her wrists, then handed her a survival knife with a 3-inch blade. She would get a 30-minute head start, he told her, and then the hunt would begin. If she could evade him until nightfall, he would let her live, though they both knew this was a lie. No one had ever lasted that long, and Hansen had no intention of changing his perfect record. Cindy ran through the dense undergrowth along the riverbank, her handcuffed wrists making it difficult to maintain balance as she crashed through the brush. Behind her, she could hear Hansen preparing his rifle and gathering his hunting gear. The sound of him loading the weapon sent a spike of pure terror through her body, and she pushed herself to run faster despite the pain in her wrists and the branches tearing at her clothes and skin. But Cindy had grown up in Alaska and knew something about wilderness survival that Hansen had not counted on. Instead of running randomly through the forest, she made her way back toward the river and found a steep embankment where she could hide while still observing Hansen's movements. She watched as he began tracking her through the woods, following her trail with the practiced ease of an experienced hunter. He moved silently through the trees, pausing occasionally to examine broken branches or footprints in the soft earth. For hours, Cindy remained hidden while Hansen searched the area around his plane. As the afternoon wore on, she noticed that he seemed increasingly frustrated and agitated. This was not going according to his usual script, and his confidence was beginning to waver. When Hansen finally returned to the plane to retrieve additional supplies, Cindy made her move. She crept out of her hiding place and made her way to the aircraft, where she found Hansen's backup radio. Despite the handcuffs, she managed to turn on the device and began broadcasting a distress signal on the emergency frequency. Her voice was hoarse from fear and exhaustion, but she managed to give her approximate location and a description of her captor before Hansen returned and discovered what she had done. Hansen flew into a rage when he found Cindy by his plane. He struck her repeatedly with the butt of his rifle and screamed that she had ruined everything. His carefully planned hunt had been compromised, and now he would have to kill her quickly and dispose of the evidence. But the damage was already done. A bush pilot flying nearby had heard Cindy's transmission and was already radioing for help. Within hours, Alaska state troopers and search aircraft were scouring the area where Cindy had broadcast from. Hansen realized that his perfect hunting ground had been exposed and that his years of undetected killing were about to come to an end. He chained Cindy back up and tried to fly to another location, but the authorities were already closing in. When he landed at a remote airstrip, police were waiting for him. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Hansen's crimes. He had killed at least 17 women over a period of more than a decade, though investigators believe the actual number was much higher. His victims were primarily sex workers and exotic dancers who would not be immediately missed, women whose disappearances were often attributed to the transient nature of their lifestyle rather than foul play. Hansen had kept detailed records of his hunts, including maps marking the locations where he had killed his victims and photographs documenting their final moments. His house yielded a horrifying collection of trophies taken from the women, items he had kept as souvenirs of his successful hunts. The basement prison where he had held his victims was equipped with chains, restraints, and torture devices that revealed the full extent of his sadistic nature. The most chilling aspect of the Hansen case was how long he had operated without detection in plain sight of his community. His neighbors described him as a quiet, helpful man who shoveled their driveways in winter and brought them fresh bread from his bakery. His customers saw him as a friendly, if shy, business owner who remembered their names and their favorite pastries. Even his own family had no idea of the monster living under their roof. Hansen was eventually convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in custody in 2014, taking with him the locations of victims whose bodies were never recovered and secrets about crimes that may never be fully understood. But his legacy lives on in the families of his victims and in the knowledge that Alaska's vast wilderness continues to hide evidence of his decades-long killing spree. The case changed how law enforcement in Alaska approaches missing persons investigations, particularly involving vulnerable populations. It also served as a stark reminder that the very isolation and anonymity that makes Alaska appealing to many also provides cover for those with the darkest intentions. In a place where people go to disappear, some disappearances are not voluntary, and the wilderness that promises freedom can become a vast unmarked grave for those unlucky enough to encounter a predator, like Robert Hansen. For Cindy, surviving Hansen's hunt was only the beginning of a long journey toward recovery. She spent years in therapy dealing with the trauma of her experience and struggling with survivor's guilt over the women who were not as fortunate. Her courage in fighting back and her quick thinking in using Hansen's radio ultimately saved not only her own life, but potentially the lives of future victims by bringing his crimes to light and ending his reign of terror in the Alaskan wilderness. Like a lot of ambitious hikers in their early 20s, Brian Harper was drawn to Alaska by the promise of untamed wilderness and the ultimate test of his outdoor skills. He had grown up in Colorado, spending his weekends climbing 14ers and his summers backpacking through the Rockies. But Alaska represented something entirely different. It was not just challenging terrain or extreme weather. It was a place where civilization disappeared completely and a person could walk for hundreds of miles without seeing another human being. For outdoor enthusiasts like Brian, Alaska was the holy grail, the final frontier where you could prove yourself against nature in its purest, most unforgiving form. As anyone who has spent serious time in the Alaskan backcountry knows, the wilderness there does not just challenge you, it actively tries to kill you, and even experienced outdoorsmen can disappear without a trace in terrain so vast and hostile that search efforts become exercises in futility. Some very strange disappearances have occurred in Alaska over the years, with experienced hikers and hunters vanishing in areas they knew well, leaving behind only scattered gear and unanswered questions. The wilderness swallows people whole, and the harsh climate and scavenging animals quickly eliminate any evidence of what happened to them. And Brian seemed like exactly the kind of person who would conquer Alaska rather than be conquered by it. He was 24 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and in the best physical condition of his life. He had been training for months specifically for this trip, running ultramarathons and carrying a weighted pack through the Colorado mountains to prepare for the challenges ahead. He was methodical in his planning, obsessive about his gear, and confident in his abilities to handle whatever Alaska could throw at him. I think it helped that Brian had the respect of the local outdoor community in Anchorage. He had spent 2 weeks in the city before his planned solo hike, visiting gear shops, talking to park rangers, and connecting with experienced Alaska hikers who could give him advice about conditions in the Chugach National Forest. Everyone who met him was impressed by his preparation and his realistic assessment of the risks involved. He was not some tourist looking for Instagram photos, but a serious mountaineer who understood the dangers and had the skills to mitigate them. One person who got to know Brian during his time in Anchorage was a local hiking guide named Marcus, who worked at a gear shop downtown. Marcus had been guiding trips in Alaska for over 15 years and had seen countless visitors underestimate the wilderness and pay the price for their overconfidence. But Brian was different, Marcus told investigators later. He asked the right questions, bought the right equipment, and demonstrated a deep understanding of backcountry safety protocols that impressed even veteran guides. Brian spent hours with Marcus going over topographic maps of the Chugach National Forest, discussing trail conditions, weather patterns, and potential hazards. He planned a 10-day solo trek through some of the most remote areas of the forest, following established trails for the first few days before branching off into unmarked wilderness where he could test his navigation skills and experience true solitude. Marcus helped him plan resupply caches and emergency contingencies, and they discussed what to do if Brian encountered wildlife or severe weather. The route Brian chose was ambitious, but not recklessly so. He would start at the Crow Pass trailhead and follow the historic Iditarod Trail south for about 20 miles before turning east into the Turnagain Arm area. From there, he planned to climb several unnamed peaks and explore remote valleys that saw perhaps a dozen visitors per year. It was challenging terrain that required advanced mountaineering skills, but Brian had demonstrated his competence on similar terrain in Colorado and seemed well prepared for the additional challenges posed by Alaska's unpredictable weather and wildlife. Brian set out on a clear morning in late August, when the weather was still relatively stable, but the tourist crowds had thinned out. He carried a 60-pound pack loaded with 10 days' worth of food, a high-quality 4-season tent, and emergency gear, including a satellite communicator that would allow him to call for help if necessary. His plan was to check in with Marcus every 2 days using the device, and if he failed to make contact, Marcus would alert the authorities and provide them with Brian's detailed itinerary. For the first 4 days, everything went according to plan. Brian's messages were brief but enthusiastic, reporting good weather, excellent trail conditions, and incredible scenery. He had reached his planned camping spots on schedule and seemed to be enjoying the solitude and challenge of navigating through some of Alaska's most pristine wilderness. His final message, sent on the evening of August 28th, reported that he was about to leave the established trail system and head into unmarked territory where satellite coverage might be spotty. When Brian failed to check in on August 30th, Marcus was not immediately concerned. Satellite communication could be unreliable in mountainous terrain, and Brian might simply be in a location where he could not get a clear signal. But when another day passed with no word, Marcus contacted the Alaska State Troopers and reported Brian as overdue. A search and rescue operation was launched within hours, with teams of experienced volunteers joining park rangers and state troopers in scouring Brian's planned route. The search effort was massive by Alaska standards, involving helicopter overflights, ground teams with tracking dogs, and coordination with bush pilots who knew the area intimately. But the Chugach National Forest covers over 5 million acres of some of the most rugged terrain in North America, and finding one person in that vast wilderness is like searching for a needle in a haystack. The searchers followed Brian's route for the first few days, finding evidence of his campsites and confirming that he had stuck to his planned itinerary. But beyond his last confirmed position, there was no trace of him. On September 5th, A helicopter crew spotted something unusual near a remote creek about 15 miles from Brian's last known location. It was pieces of his backpack, scattered across a small clearing as if they had been torn apart and thrown around. The searchers rappelled down from the helicopter and began collecting the debris, hoping to find clues about what had happened to Brian. What they found was deeply disturbing. Brian's pack had been shredded with what appeared to be tremendous force, the heavy nylon fabric torn into strips and scattered over a wide area. His sleeping bag had been pulled from the pack and ripped open. The synthetic insulation spread across the ground like snow. Food containers were crushed and empty, their contents gone. Most unsettling of all, there were large amounts of blood soaked into the earth around the debris field. Far more blood than could come from minor injuries. The search teams examined the scene carefully, looking for tracks or other evidence that might explain what had happened. They found prints in the soft earth around the creek, massive paw prints that were larger than anything left by known wildlife in the area. The prints were bear-like but enormous, suggesting an animal much larger than even the biggest brown bears typically found in Alaska. Some of the prints showed clear claw marks that had gouged deep furrows in the ground, but there were other tracks as well, prints that defied easy categorization. Some appeared to be from bare human feet, but they were elongated and showed claw marks at the tips of what should have been toes. The stride length suggested something much taller than a normal human, and the depth of the impressions indicated incredible weight and power. Most disturbing of all, the human-like tracks seemed to follow the same path as the massive paw prints, as if two different creatures had been working together. The searchers also found Brian's rifle, a powerful lever-action .30-30 that he had carried for protection against bears. The weapon had been fired recently, with 2 spent cartridges lying nearby, but it had been twisted and bent as if something with tremendous strength had crushed it like a tin can. The stock was splintered, and the barrel was actually bent at a 90-degree angle, damage that would require thousands of pounds of force to inflict. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Local bush pilots reported seeing strange lights in the area around the time Brian disappeared, bright flashes that illuminated the forest canopy but had no obvious source. Native Alaskans from nearby villages told stories of creatures they called the Tornarsuk, massive beings that were part bear and part man and hunted in the deepest wilderness. According to their legends, the Tornarsuk could mimic human voices and would call out to lost travelers, luring them deeper into the forest where they would never be seen again. The official search for Brian continued for 2 weeks, with teams combing every valley and ridge within a 50-mile radius of where his gear was found. They discovered a few more pieces of his equipment scattered over a wide area, including his compass and water bottles, but nothing that provided definitive answers about his fate. The blood evidence was sent to laboratories for analysis, confirming that it was human and matched Brian's blood type. But there was not enough for more detailed DNA testing. Marcus organized private search efforts that continued long after the official operation was called off. He felt responsible for Brian's disappearance and could not shake the feeling that there were clues he had missed or areas that had not been properly searched. He spent his own money hiring bush pilots to fly aerial surveys and organized volunteer teams to explore remote areas that the official searchers had not reached. During one of these private searches, Marcus's team found something that chilled them to the bone. In a cave system about 20 miles from where Brian's gear was discovered, they found what appeared to be a primitive shelter constructed from branches, moss, and animal hides. Inside the shelter were bones, lots of bones, including what forensic experts later identified as human remains from multiple individuals. Some of the bones showed clear bite marks from massive teeth, while others had been cracked open as if to extract the marrow. The cave also contained personal items that belonged to other missing hikers, people who had disappeared in Alaska over the past several years. There were pieces of camping equipment, hiking boots, and even a wallet containing identification from a man who had vanished 3 years earlier. It was as if the cave served as some kind of trophy room or feeding den for whatever creature was responsible for these disappearances. But perhaps most unsettling of all, the searchers found evidence that the cave had been recently occupied. There were fresh kills hanging from the ceiling, animal carcasses in various stages of decomposition, and what appeared to be sleeping areas lined with more recent clothing and gear. Whatever lived in the cave was still active, still hunting, and still claiming victims from among those brave or foolish enough to venture into the deepest wilderness of Alaska. The investigation into Brian's disappearance remains open to this day, though no official explanation has ever been provided for what happened to him. The evidence suggests an encounter with something far more dangerous than the bears, wolves, or harsh weather that typically threaten hikers in Alaska. Local authorities quietly discourage solo hiking in the area where Brian vanished, and experienced guides now warn their clients about the risks of venturing too far into unmarked wilderness. For Marcus and the other members of the outdoor community who knew Brian, his disappearance serves as a sobering reminder that Alaska still holds secrets that defy rational explanation. The wilderness that attracts adventurers with its promise of solitude and challenge may also harbor predators that exist beyond the boundaries of modern understanding. Creatures that view human visitors not as fellow inhabitants of the natural world, but as prey to be hunted and consumed in the endless darkness of the Alaskan interior. Like a lot of bush pilots who made their living flying hunters and fishermen into the remote corners of Alaska, Chuck Carpuchetz thought he had seen everything the wilderness could throw at him. He had been flying in Alaska since the early 1970s, logging thousands of hours over some of the most dangerous and unpredictable terrain on the continent. He had survived engine failures over trackless wilderness, landed on improvised strips carved out of frozen tundra, and weathered storms that would have grounded commercial aircraft for days. For pilots like Chuck, Alaska was not just a job, it was a proving ground where only the most skilled and experienced survived, and where the margin for error was measured in life and death rather than dollars and cents. As anyone who has flown bush planes in Alaska knows, the wilderness does not forgive mistakes, and pilots who push their luck too far tend to become statistics rather than legends. Some very strange incidents had been reported by bush pilots over the years, with experienced aviators claiming to have seen things in the remote lakes and rivers that defied rational explanation. The vast waterways of interior Alaska were largely unexplored and unmapped, and the depths of some lakes had never been measured or investigated. And Chuck was exactly the kind of pilot who dismissed such stories as the products of isolation fatigue or too much time spent alone in the cockpit. He was a practical man who believed in what he could see, touch, and measure, and he had no patience for tales of monsters or mysterious creatures lurking in Alaska's waters. I think it helped that Chuck had built his reputation on reliability and level-headed thinking. He was the pilot that other pilots called when conditions were too dangerous for anyone else. The guy who could land a float plane on a lake the size of a parking lot, or navigate through weather that kept everyone else grounded. His clients trusted him with their lives, and he took that responsibility seriously. In 30 years of flying, he had never filed a report that could not be verified or made a claim that could not be substantiated with hard evidence. One regular client who flew with Chuck was a fishing guide named Nate Peterson, who had been working the waters around Lake Iliamna for over 20 years. Nate was a fourth-generation Alaskan who had grown up hearing stories about the lake from his grandfather. Tales of massive creatures that lived in the depths and occasionally surfaced to terrorize fishermen or overturn boats. Lake Iliamna was the largest lake in Alaska, covering over 1,000 square miles and reaching depths that had never been fully measured. The water was so deep and so cold that bodies of drowning victims were rarely recovered, and the lake had a reputation among locals as a place where strange things happened and people disappeared without explanation. Chuck and Nate had flown together dozens of times over the years, with Chuck providing transportation to remote fishing spots, while Nate guided wealthy clients from the lower 48 who were willing to pay premium prices for trophy salmon and trout. They had developed an easy working relationship based on mutual respect and shared experience, and Chuck valued Nate's knowledge of local water conditions and weather patterns. When Nate called in early September of 1987, requesting a flight to the northern end of Lake Iliamna, Chuck agreed without hesitation, despite reports of unstable weather moving in from the Gulf of Alaska. They took off from Anchorage in Chuck's de Havilland Beaver floatplane on a gray morning with low clouds and intermittent rain. The weather was marginal for flying, but both men had operated in worse conditions and felt confident they could complete the trip safely. Their destination was a remote bay on the north shore of Lake Iliamna, where Nate had been having success with late-season salmon runs, and they planned to spend 2 days fishing before returning to Anchorage. The flight to Lake Iliamna took about 2 hours, with Chuck navigating through scattered clouds and occasional rain squalls. As they approached the lake, the weather began to clear, and they could see the massive expanse of dark water stretching to the horizon. Lake Iliamna was so large that it created its own weather patterns, and experienced pilots knew to expect sudden changes in wind and visibility when flying over its waters. Chuck had landed on the lake hundreds of times over the years and knew its moods and temperaments as well as any pilot in Alaska. But as they descended toward their planned landing spot, Chuck noticed something unusual about the water conditions. The lake surface was unnaturally calm despite winds that should have created significant waves, and there were strange patterns in the water that looked almost like massive currents or disturbances moving just beneath the surface. Nate noticed it too and commented that he had never seen the lake behave quite like this, even after decades of fishing its waters. Chuck set up his approach carefully, checking his airspeed and altitude as he brought the floatplane down toward the glassy surface of the lake. The landing was smooth and uneventful, with the floats kissing the water gently, and the plane settling into its taxi configuration. They motored toward shore, looking for a suitable beaching spot where they could secure the plane and unload their gear. That was when they saw it. About 200 yards off their port wing, the surface of Lake Iliamna began to bulge upward, as if something massive was rising from the depths. At first, Chuck thought it might be a large log or piece of debris floating just beneath the surface, but as they watched, the disturbance grew larger and more pronounced. The water began to form a dome shape that rose several feet above the normal surface level, and they could see something dark and solid moving underneath. Nate grabbed Chuck's arm and pointed at the anomaly, his voice tight with excitement and fear. The thing beneath the water was enormous, easily the size of a school bus and possibly much larger. As it moved, it created powerful currents that rocked their floatplane despite the distance, and they could hear strange sounds coming from the water, low-frequency rumbles that seemed to vibrate through the aircraft's hull. Chuck immediately started the engine and began to taxi away from the disturbance, but whatever was beneath the surface seemed to be following them. The dome of water moved parallel to their course, staying about the same distance away but clearly tracking their movement. As they watched in growing alarm, parts of the creature began to break the surface, revealing glimpses of something that defied easy description. What they saw was not like any known aquatic animal. The creature appeared to have multiple humps or segments along its back, each one the size of a small car and covered in what looked like dark, scaled skin. Between the humps, they could see portions of a massive body that seemed to undulate through the water with serpentine grace. Most disturbing of all, they caught glimpses of what appeared to be a head at the front of the creature, a massive triangular shape with eyes that glowed with an eerie phosphorescent light. The creature surfaced completely for just a moment, revealing its full size and shocking both men into silence. It was at least 60 feet long from head to tail, with a body as thick as a railroad car and appendages that might have been fins or legs extending from its sides. The head was reptilian, but also strangely mammalian, with intelligent eyes and what appeared to be nostrils that expelled powerful jets of water vapor. The creature's skin was dark gray, or black, and seemed to shift and ripple in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But the most terrifying moment came when the creature seemed to notice their aircraft. It turned toward them with deliberate intent, and Chuck could see intelligence in those glowing eyes, a malevolent awareness that recognized them as intruders in its domain. The creature began to move toward them with increasing speed, creating a wake that looked more like the bow wave of a large ship than anything produced by a living animal. Chuck pushed the throttles to maximum power and began his takeoff run, but the float plane was heavily loaded with fuel and gear and needed time to build up sufficient speed. Behind them, the creature was gaining ground rapidly, moving through the water faster than anything that size should have been able to travel. Nate was shouting directions and watching their pursuer, reporting that the thing was only 50 yards away and still closing fast. The float plane finally reached takeoff speed and Chuck pulled back on the controls, lifting them into the air just as the creature reached their position. As they climbed away from the water, they felt a tremendous impact against the aircraft's hull, a blow that knocked them both against their restraints and caused the engine to momentarily stutter. Chuck fought to maintain control as the plane shuddered and vibrated, checking his instruments for signs of damage while Nate looked back to see what had hit them. The creature had breached completely out of the water in its attempt to reach their aircraft, launching itself into the air with incredible force. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, the massive beast hung suspended above Lake Iliamna, water streaming from its body as it reached toward them, with appendages that looked disturbingly like arms or tentacles. Then gravity reasserted itself, and the creature crashed back into the lake, sending up a geyser of water that rose nearly as high as their aircraft. Chuck did not wait to see what would happen next. He climbed rapidly to gain altitude and distance, his hands shaking on the controls as he processed what they had just experienced. The creature's impact had damaged one of their floats, causing a slow leak that would make landing back on water dangerous, if not impossible. They would have to return to anchorage immediately and hope they could make it to a runway before the damaged float failed completely. The flight back to Anchorage was tense and silent, with both men trying to process what they had witnessed. Chuck had seen bears, moose, and even whales during his years of flying, but nothing that compared to the size and apparent intelligence of the creature they had encountered. Nate, despite his decades of experience on Alaska's waters, admitted that he had never seen anything remotely similar to what had just tried to attack their aircraft. When they landed safely at Anchorage Airport, Chuck immediately began inspecting the damage to his float plane. What he found was deeply disturbing. The aluminum hull showed clear impact marks from something with tremendous force, but the damage was not random. There were parallel gouges that looked like claw marks, scratches that had been made by something with intelligence and purpose, rather than accidental contact. Most unsettling of all, embedded in the damaged float were several triangular objects that looked disturbingly like teeth, massive fangs that had broken off when the creature struck their aircraft. Chuck reported the incident to aviation authorities and provided a detailed written account of what they had experienced, but the official response was skeptical at best. Without photographs or additional witnesses, the incident was classified as an encounter with an unknown large marine animal, possibly a whale or large seal that had been misidentified due to poor visibility and stress. The physical damage to the aircraft was acknowledged, but attributed to impact with floating debris rather than a living creature. But Chuck and Nate knew what they had seen, and the experience changed both men permanently. Chuck never flew over Lake Iliamna, again claiming mechanical problems or scheduling conflicts whenever clients requested trips to the area. Nate stopped guiding fishing expeditions to the lake and eventually moved his operation to smaller, shallower waters where he felt safer. Both men became reluctant to discuss the incident publicly, but they privately shared their story with other pilots and guides as a warning about the dangers that might lurk beneath Alaska's remote waters. The creature they encountered at Lake Iliamna remains unexplained to this day. Native Alaskan traditions speak of massive water spirits that inhabit the deepest lakes, beings that are older than human memory and fiercely protective of their territory. Scientists have speculated about unknown species of marine reptiles or prehistoric creatures that might have survived in Alaska's isolated waterways, but no conclusive evidence has ever been found. For Chuck and Nate, the encounter served as a stark reminder that Alaska still harbors mysteries that defy modern understanding. The wilderness they thought they knew so well had revealed itself to contain dangers beyond their imagination, creatures that existed in the spaces between myth and reality. Their experience at Lake Iliamna became a cautionary tale shared quietly among Alaska's aviation and guiding communities, a warning that some waters are better left undisturbed, and some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate too closely. Like a lot of people who grew up in remote Alaskan communities, Ashley Morrison had been around wildlife her entire life and thought she understood the natural order of the wilderness that surrounded her hometown of Port Protection. She had learned to hunt and fish from her father Marcus when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle, and by the age of 16 she could track deer through dense forest, navigate by the stars, and survive for days in the backcountry with nothing but a pack and her knowledge of the land. For kids like Ashley who were raised in the bush, Alaska was not a hostile environment to be conquered, but a home to be respected, and the animals that lived there were neighbors rather than threats. As anyone who has spent serious time in Southeast Alaska knows, the relationship between humans and wildlife is complex and delicate, built on mutual understanding and careful boundaries that have been established over generations of coexistence. Some very strange encounters had been reported in the Port Protection area over the years, with experienced hunters claiming to have witnessed wolf behavior that defied everything scientists knew about these normally predictable predators. The wolves of Southeast Alaska were typically smaller and more cautious than their interior cousins, preferring to avoid human contact and hunt in the dense forests where they could remain hidden from view. And Ashley was exactly the kind of person who dismissed such stories as the products of fear, inexperience, or too much time spent alone in the woods. She had encountered wolves dozens of times during her hunting trips and had always found them to be intelligent but ultimately predictable animals that followed well-established patterns of behavior. I think it helped that Ashley had been raised by a father who understood both the wildlife and the old stories that surrounded it. Marcus Morrison was a third-generation resident of Port Protection who had learned hunting and survival skills from his own grandfather, a Tlingit elder who had passed down traditional knowledge about the land and its inhabitants. Marcus taught Ashley to respect the wolves as apex predators, while understanding that they posed little direct threat to humans who followed proper precautions and avoided interfering with pack territory or den sites. One hunting partner who regularly accompanied Ashley and her father was an older man named Derek Williamson, who had moved to Port Protection in the 1980s after retiring from a career in commercial fishing. Derek was in his early 60s, but remained an excellent shot and an experienced tracker who knew the island terrain as well as any longtime resident. He had become something of a surrogate grandfather to Ashley, teaching her advanced hunting techniques and sharing stories about his adventures in Alaska's remote fishing grounds. Ashley and Derek had been planning a deer hunting trip for weeks, waiting for the right combination of weather and tides that would allow them to access some of the more remote areas where the largest bucks could be found. In late October of 2003, conditions finally aligned, and they decided to attempt a challenging hunt in the mountainous interior of Prince of Wales Island, an area that required a long hike through dense forest but offered the possibility of trophy-sized Sitka black-tailed deer. They set out before dawn on a cold, clear morning with temperatures hovering just above freezing. The plan was to hike about 8 miles inland to a series of alpine meadows where Derek had seen promising sign during a scouting trip the previous month. The terrain was challenging, with steep ridges and thick undergrowth that made travel slow and demanding, but both hunters were in good physical condition and confident in their ability to handle the difficult conditions. The first sign that something was unusual came about 4 hours into their hike, when they began noticing wolf tracks that seemed to be following their route. Ashley had seen wolf tracks many times before, but these were different in several disturbing ways. First, the tracks were unusually large, suggesting animals that were significantly bigger than the typical Southeast Alaska wolves she was familiar with. Second, the tracks seemed fresh and were clearly following the same path Ashley and Derek had taken, as if the wolves were deliberately trailing them. Derek examined the tracks carefully and confirmed Ashley's observations. The animals that had made these prints were not only larger than normal, but also seemed to be traveling in a pack that was much bigger than typical wolf family groups. Most wolf packs in southeast Alaska consisted of 4 to 6 animals, but the tracks they were seeing suggested at least a dozen wolves, possibly more. Even more disturbing, the tracks showed no signs of the normal hunting behavior that wolves displayed when moving through their territory. Instead, the animals seemed to be moving with purpose and coordination that suggested they were tracking specific prey. As they continued their ascent toward the alpine meadows, Ashley and Derek began to feel as though they were being watched. The forest around them had become unnaturally quiet, with none of the normal bird calls or small animal sounds that typically accompanied a walk through the woods. Even the wind seemed muted, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that put both hunters on edge. They began checking their back trail more frequently and keeping their rifles at the ready, though neither wanted to admit to the other how nervous they had become. About 6 hours into their hike, they reached the edge of the alpine zone, where the dense forest gave way to open meadows and scattered stands of timber. The change in terrain should have made them feel more secure, as the open ground would make it difficult for predators to approach without being seen, but instead Ashley felt more exposed and vulnerable than she had in the thick forest below. The wolf tracks continued across the meadow, still following their exact route, and fresh scat indicated that the pack had passed through the area very recently. Derek suggested they abandon their hunting plans and return to town, but Ashley was reluctant to give up after hiking so far and working so hard to reach their destination. She argued that wolves were naturally curious about humans and might simply be investigating their scent trail without any hostile intent. They had both encountered wolves before without incident, and Ashley believed their concerns might be overblown. Derek reluctantly agreed to continue, but insisted they stay together and remain alert for any signs of danger. They spent the afternoon hunting in the alpine meadows without success, seeing plenty of deer sign, but no animals. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, they decided to make camp in a protected area near a small creek where they could have fresh water and some shelter from the wind. Derek built a fire while Ashley prepared their dinner, both of them trying to maintain normal conversation despite the growing feeling that they were not alone in the wilderness. As darkness fell, they began to hear sounds that chilled them to the bone. It started as distant howling, the normal vocalizations that wolves use to communicate with their packmates across long distances. But as the night progressed, the howling grew closer and more frequent, and Ashley began to realize that the sounds were not coming from a normal wolf pack. The vocalizations were deeper and more varied than anything she had heard before, with complex harmonies and patterns that seemed almost musical in their complexity. Derek had hunted and trapped wolves for decades and had never heard anything like the sounds they were experiencing. The howling seemed to come from all directions, suggesting that the pack had surrounded their camp and was communicating in ways that demonstrated sophisticated coordination and planning. Most disturbing of all, some of the vocalizations sounded disturbingly human, with tones and inflections that seemed to mimic human speech patterns. Around midnight, the howling stopped completely and was replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying than the sounds had been. Ashley and Derek sat by their fire with their rifles across their knees, straining to hear any indication of where the wolves might be or what they were planning. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the crackling of their fire and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Then they began to see eyes reflecting the firelight from the darkness beyond their camp. At first, there were just a few pairs of glowing orbs, but as Ashley and Derek watched in growing horror, more and more eyes appeared until they were completely surrounded by dozens of wolves watching them from the shadows. The animals remained motionless and silent, creating a ring of predators that completely encircled their small camp. What happened next defied everything Ashley thought she knew about wolf behavior. Instead of attacking or retreating, the pack began to move closer in a coordinated fashion that demonstrated intelligence and planning that seemed almost human in its sophistication. The wolves advanced step by step, maintaining their formation and never breaking eye contact with the two hunters huddled by their fire. Most terrifying of all, Ashley could see that these were not normal wolves. They were massive animals, much larger than any wolves she had ever encountered, with intelligent eyes and movements that suggested awareness and purpose that went beyond normal predator behavior. Derek raised his rifle and fired a warning shot over the heads of the approaching wolves, expecting them to scatter as any normal pack would when confronted with human aggression. Instead, the wolves stopped their advance, but remained in formation, showing no fear of the gunshot or the humans who had produced it. They seemed to be evaluating the situation and making decisions based on intelligence rather than instinct. For hours, Ashley and Derek remained trapped in their camp, while the wolf pack maintained its silent vigil around them. The animals never attacked, but they also never retreated, creating a standoff that stretched through the longest night of Ashley's life. As dawn approached, something even stranger happened. The largest wolf in the pack, an enormous animal that seemed to be the alpha leader, stepped forward into the firelight and approached within 30 yards of their camp. The animal was unlike anything Ashley had ever seen. It stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder and had to weigh close to 200 pounds, making it larger than many black bears. Its coat was a mixture of gray and black that seemed to shift and change in the flickering firelight, and its eyes held an intelligence that was distinctly unsettling. Most disturbing of all, the animal seemed to be studying them with the same careful evaluation that a human predator might use when sizing up potential victims. The alpha wolf stared at Ashley and Derek for several minutes, its head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds they could not hear. Then, without warning, it threw back its head and released a howl that was unlike anything either hunter had ever experienced. The sound was deep and resonant, carrying harmonics and overtones that seemed to vibrate through their bodies and into their bones. It was followed immediately by answering howls from the rest of the pack, creating a symphony of sound that filled the alpine meadow and echoed off the surrounding peaks. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves melted back into the darkness and disappeared. Ashley and Derek remained by their fire until full daylight, afraid to move or sleep, but the pack never returned. When they finally worked up the courage to examine the area around their camp, they found tracks everywhere, clear evidence that dozens of massive wolves had indeed surrounded them during the night. But there was something else, something that neither hunter ever reported to authorities or discussed with anyone outside their immediate family. Mixed in with the wolf tracks were other prints, marks that looked disturbingly human, but showed signs of claws and proportions that were not quite right. The stride length suggested something much taller than a normal person, and the depth of the impressions indicated incredible weight and power. Most unsettling of all, these human-like tracks seemed to lead the wolf prints, as if something that walked upright had been directing the pack's movements and coordinating their behavior. Ashley and Derek packed up their camp and hiked out of the mountains as quickly as possible, abandoning their hunting plans and equipment in their haste to reach civilization. Neither of them ever returned to that area of Prince of Wales Island, and both became reluctant to discuss their experience with anyone who had not lived in Alaska long enough to understand that some encounters with wilderness could not be explained by conventional means. The incident changed Ashley's relationship with the Alaskan wilderness permanently. She continued to hunt and fish, but never again ventured into the remote areas where she had grown up feeling completely at home. Derek moved away from port protection within a year of their encounter, claiming that his retirement plans had changed, but Ashley suspected that the experience had shaken his confidence in his ability to survive in the bush. Local Tlingit elders, when quietly approached about the incident, nodded knowingly and spoke of old stories about wolves that were more than wolves, creatures that served as guardians of the deep wilderness and would tolerate human presence only to a point. According to their traditions, these spirit wolves could take human form when necessary and possessed intelligence that rivaled or exceeded that of humans. They were not evil, the elders explained, but they were fiercely protective of their territory and would not hesitate to eliminate threats to the natural order they had been appointed to protect. For Ashley, the encounter served as a reminder that Alaska still harbored mysteries that existed beyond the boundaries of scientific understanding. The wilderness she had thought she knew so well had revealed itself to contain guardians and protectors that operated according to rules and motivations that defied conventional explanation. Her experience with the spirit wolves became a cautionary tale that she shared quietly with other hunters and outdoors enthusiasts, a warning that some areas of Alaska were under protection that went far beyond what any government agency could provide. Like a lot of Alaska natives who grew up on the frozen lakes and rivers of the interior, Samuel Kowalski had been ice fishing since he was old enough to hold a rod and had never experienced anything on the ice that truly frightened him. He had spent countless winter days drilling holes through 3-foot-thick ice, waiting patiently for northern pike and lake trout to take his bait, and he understood the rhythms and dangers of Alaska's frozen waterways, as well as anyone in the Fairbanks area. For guys like Samuel, who made their living as fishing guides and wilderness outfitters, the ice season was not just recreation, but an essential source of income that supplemented the summer tourist business. As anyone who has spent serious time on Alaska's frozen lakes knows, the ice is a living, breathing entity that constantly shifts and changes, and even experienced fishermen can find themselves in life-threatening situations when conditions deteriorate faster than anyone could predict. Some very dangerous incidents had occurred on the remote lakes around Fairbanks over the years, with experienced ice fishermen disappearing through weak ice or becoming stranded when sudden weather changes made travel back to shore impossible. The combination of extreme cold, unpredictable ice conditions, and the vast distances involved made ice fishing in Alaska a potentially deadly pursuit that required constant vigilance and careful preparation. And Samuel was exactly the kind of fisherman who took every precaution seriously, carrying safety gear, checking ice thickness regularly, and never venturing onto questionable ice without proper equipment and backup plans. I think it helped that Samuel had been taught ice fishing by his grandfather Leon, a Polish immigrant who had moved to Alaska in the 1940s and learned to survive in the harsh interior climate through careful observation and respect for the natural environment. Leon had passed down not only fishing techniques, but also traditional knowledge about reading ice conditions, understanding weather patterns, and recognizing the warning signs that preceded dangerous situations. Samuel valued this old-school approach and combined it with modern safety equipment to create a systematic approach to ice fishing that had kept him safe through decades of winter expeditions. One regular fishing partner who accompanied Samuel on his winter trips was a younger man named Tyler Hendricks, who had moved to Alaska from Montana and was eager to learn the specialized techniques required for successful ice fishing in the extreme conditions of the far north. Tyler was in his late 20s, physically fit, and had extensive experience with cold weather camping and winter survival, but he lacked the specific knowledge of Alaskan ice conditions that could mean the difference between a successful fishing trip and a deadly disaster. Samuel and Tyler had been planning an ambitious ice fishing expedition to a remote lake about 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks, an area that was accessible only by snowmobile during the winter months and offered the possibility of catching trophy-sized lake trout that rarely saw fishing pressure from other anglers. The lake was located in a valley surrounded by low mountains and was fed by several springs that kept portions of the water from freezing completely, creating ideal habitat for large fish that remained active throughout the winter. They set out on a Friday morning in early February, when temperatures were hovering around minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to ensure solid ice conditions, but not so cold as to make camping uncomfortable with proper gear. Their plan was to spend 3 days on the lake, fishing during the daylight hours, and camping in a heated ice shelter that Samuel had used successfully on previous trips. They carried enough food and fuel for a week, in case weather conditions prevented their planned return on Sunday evening. The 60-mile snowmobile ride to the lake took about 3 hours over rough terrain that included frozen swamps, steep ridges, and several stream crossings where the ice conditions had to be carefully evaluated before proceeding. Samuel led the way on his powerful Arctic Cat snowmobile, while Tyler followed on a smaller machine, both of them pulling cargo sleds loaded with fishing gear, camping equipment, and emergency supplies. The weather was clear and cold with no wind, perfect conditions for their planned expedition. When they arrived at the lake in the early afternoon, everything looked exactly as Samuel expected, based on his previous visits to the area. The lake was completely frozen over with snow-covered ice that appeared thick and solid, and there were no obvious signs of pressure ridges or other dangerous conditions that might indicate unstable ice. Samuel used his ice auger to drill several test holes around their planned fishing area, confirming that the ice was more than 30 inches thick and perfectly safe for their activities. They spent the remainder of Friday setting up their camp and drilling fishing holes in promising locations around the lake. Their ice shelter was a sophisticated insulated structure that could comfortably house both men and their equipment while providing protection from wind and cold. Samuel had installed a small propane heater that would keep the interior temperature well above freezing, even when outside temperatures dropped to dangerous levels during the night. Saturday morning dawned clear and brutally cold, with temperatures that Samuel estimated at around minus 30 degrees. They began fishing before sunrise, taking advantage of the early morning period when lake trout were most likely to be feeding actively. The fishing was excellent, with both men catching several nice fish during the first few hours of daylight. Tyler was impressed by the quality of the fishing and the effectiveness of Samuel's techniques for attracting fish in the extreme cold conditions. But around noon, Samuel began to notice subtle changes in the ice conditions that made him increasingly nervous. The solid, uniform surface they had been fishing on was beginning to show hairline cracks that seemed to radiate outward from some of their fishing holes. More disturbing, Samuel could hear occasional groaning and popping sounds coming from deep within the ice, sounds that indicated the frozen surface was under stress and potentially unstable. Tyler did not initially understand the significance of these warning signs, but Samuel recognized them as indicators that the ice was beginning to shift and weaken due to changes in temperature, water level, or underwater currents. He had experienced similar conditions before, and knew they could deteriorate rapidly from merely concerning to immediately life-threatening. Samuel suggested they consider packing up and heading back to Fairbanks, but Tyler was reluctant to abandon their successful fishing trip after traveling so far and investing so much time in the expedition. Samuel agreed to continue fishing for another hour while monitoring conditions carefully, but his concerns proved to be well-founded. Around 2 o'clock, they heard a sound that every ice fisherman dreads, the sharp crack of ice beginning to separate under pressure. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beneath their feet, a deep rumbling that suggested massive forces at work in the frozen lake. Samuel immediately ordered Tyler to gather their essential gear and prepare to evacuate their fishing area. But as they began packing their equipment, the situation deteriorated faster than either man had anticipated. The hairline cracks they had noticed earlier suddenly widened into visible fissures that began spreading across the ice surface in all directions. What had been solid, safe ice just minutes earlier was now a dangerous maze of shifting plates and unstable sections that could collapse without warning. Most terrifying of all, their route back to shore was blocked by a massive crack that had opened up between their position and the edge of the lake. Tyler began to panic as he realized they were trapped on a section of ice that was becoming increasingly unstable with each passing minute. The groaning and popping sounds from beneath them were getting louder and more frequent, and Samuel could see that their ice shelter was beginning to tilt as the surface beneath it shifted and settled. Their snowmobiles, which represented their only means of escape from the remote lake, were parked on ice that was now visibly moving up and down with the motion of the water underneath. Samuel forced himself to remain calm and think through their options systematically. They could not cross the major crack that separated them from shore, as the gap was too wide to jump, and the edges were too unstable to support a bridge or temporary crossing. Their section of ice was still relatively thick and stable, but it was clearly separating from the main ice sheet and could break away completely at any moment. If that happened, they would be stranded on a floating ice island with no way to reach safety. The temperature was beginning to drop as afternoon progressed toward evening, and Samuel knew they had only a few hours of daylight left to resolve their situation before they would be forced to spend the night on unstable ice in life-threatening cold. Their ice shelter was no longer safe to use, as the shifting ice beneath it had caused the structure to lean at a dangerous angle that could collapse if the ice moved any further. Samuel made the difficult decision to abandon most of their gear and attempt to find a way across the crack that separated them from shore. Using his ice spear, he began probing the edges of the crack to look for spots where the gap might be narrow enough to cross, or where the ice might be thick enough to support their weight temporarily. Tyler gathered their most essential survival gear, including emergency food, matches, and a sleeping bag, in case they became stranded overnight. What they discovered was worse than either man had feared. The crack was not just a simple separation in the ice surface, but a complex system of fractures that extended deep into the ice sheet and showed signs of continuing expansion. The edges of the crack were sharp and unstable, with chunks of ice regularly breaking away and falling into the dark water below. Even more disturbing, Samuel could see that the water level in the crack was rising and falling rhythmically, suggesting that their ice island was floating free and bobbing up and down with wave action from beneath the lake surface. As darkness approached and the temperature continued to drop, Samuel and Tyler were forced to accept that they would have to survive the night on their floating piece of ice with minimal shelter and no source of heat. They constructed a crude windbreak using their abandoned fishing equipment and huddled together in Tyler's sleeping bag, sharing body heat and taking turns staying awake to monitor their situation. The ice beneath them continued to groan and shift throughout the night, and several times they felt their island tip and sway as it responded to underwater currents and pressure changes. The longest night of both men's lives was marked by the constant fear that their ice island would break apart or flip over, dumping them into water so cold that survival would be measured in minutes rather than hours. Samuel used his experience and knowledge to keep Tyler calm and focused on survival priorities. But privately, he began to doubt their chances of making it through to morning. The sounds coming from the ice were getting worse, and he could feel their island getting smaller as pieces broke away around the edges throughout the night. Dawn brought both hope and new terror. The crack that had trapped them had widened significantly during the night and was now more than 20 feet across, but the extreme cold had also caused new ice to begin forming across the gap. Samuel realized they might have a narrow window of opportunity to cross on the thin new ice before it became too weak to support their weight, or before their island broke apart completely. Using techniques his grandfather had taught him for testing questionable ice, Samuel carefully probed the new ice formation and determined that it might be strong enough to support one person at a time if they distributed their weight properly and moved quickly. Tyler would have to go first, carrying their essential gear, while Samuel followed with the emergency supplies. If either man broke through the thin ice, the other would attempt a rescue, but both understood that their chances of survival in the water were essentially zero. Tyler made the crossing successfully, crawling on his belly to distribute his weight and using his ice spear to probe ahead for weak spots. Samuel followed with their remaining gear, feeling the thin ice flex and crack beneath him, but managing to reach the other side just as his section began to give way. Behind them, their ice island continued to drift away from shore, taking with it their expensive fishing equipment and snowmobiles that represented Samuel's livelihood as a guide and outfitter. The hike back to the nearest road took 2 days through deep snow and bitter cold, with both men suffering from frostbite and exhaustion by the time they reached help. Samuel lost 3 toes to frostbite, and Tyler required surgery to save several fingers. But both men survived what could easily have been a fatal encounter with the unpredictable forces that govern Alaska's frozen waterways. The experience ended Samuel's career as an ice fishing guide and left both men with permanent reminders of how quickly conditions can change in the Alaskan wilderness. The incident served as a wake-up call for the ice fishing community around Fairbanks, leading to improved safety protocols and better education about recognizing dangerous ice conditions. Samuel became an advocate for ice safety training and spent his recovery time developing educational materials to help other fishermen avoid the mistakes that had nearly cost him and Tyler their lives. For both men, the experience reinforced the harsh reality that Alaska's wilderness operates according to its own rules and timetable, and even experienced outdoorsmen can find themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control or understanding. Like a lot of experienced hunters who grew up in the remote villages of southeast Alaska, Marcus Johnson had been tracking game through the dense coastal forests since he was old enough to carry a rifle, and had never encountered anything in the wilderness that made him question his understanding of the natural world. He had spent 4 decades hunting deer, bear, and moose in some of the most challenging terrain on the continent, learning to read animal sign and navigate through fog-shrouded forests, where visibility was often measured in yards rather than miles. For hunters like Marcus, who lived off the land and supplemented their income by guiding visitors from the lower 48, the wilderness was not a hostile environment to be conquered, but a complex ecosystem to be understood and respected. As anyone who has spent serious time in the temperate rainforests of southeast Alaska knows, the combination of dense vegetation, unpredictable weather, and dangerous wildlife creates challenges that test even the most experienced outdoorsmen. Some very strange encounters had been reported by hunters in the Prince of Wales Island area over the years, with experienced woodsmen claiming to have witnessed animal behavior and phenomena that defied conventional explanation. The ancient forests of southeast Alaska were home to creatures and forces that existed beyond the boundaries of modern scientific understanding, and even longtime residents occasionally experienced things that challenged their assumptions about the natural world. And Marcus was exactly the kind of person who dismissed such stories as the products of fatigue, poor visibility, or too much time spent alone in the woods. He was a practical man who believed in what he could see and measure, and he had no patience for tales of mysterious creatures or supernatural encounters. I think it helped that Marcus had built his reputation on reliability and deep knowledge of the local ecosystem. He was the guide that wealthy hunters requested by name when they wanted to experience authentic Alaskan hunting, the man who could find trophy-sized black bears in terrain where other guides came up empty-handed. His clients trusted his judgment and his ability to keep them safe in conditions that would challenge far younger and more athletic hunters. In 30 years of guiding, he had never lost a client or experienced a hunting accident that could not be explained by normal circumstances. One regular client who hunted with Marcus every fall was a successful businessman named Warren Phillips, who had been coming to Alaska for over 15 years and had developed both the skills and the respect for the wilderness that Marcus demanded of his hunters. Warren was in his mid-50s, in excellent physical condition despite his sedentary job, and had invested considerable time and money in developing the marksmanship and woodcraft skills necessary for successful hunting in challenging conditions. More importantly, he understood and followed the safety protocols that Marcus had developed over decades of guiding hunters through some of the most dangerous terrain in Alaska. Marcus and Warren had planned an ambitious black bear hunt for early October, when the bears would be actively feeding in preparation for winter hibernation, and the fall rains had not yet made travel through the forest too difficult. Their destination was a remote valley on Prince of Wales Island that was accessible only by boat and offered excellent hunting opportunities in an area that saw very little pressure from other hunters. The valley was fed by a salmon stream that attracted large numbers of bears during the fall spawning runs, creating ideal conditions for finding trophy-sized animals. They traveled to the hunting area in Marcus's aluminum skiff, a 24-foot boat powered by twin outboard motors that could handle the rough waters and strong tides of the Inside Passage. The journey from Ketchikan took most of a day, with stops to refuel and check weather conditions as they navigated through narrow channels and around rocky islands that could be treacherous in poor visibility. The forecast called for clear weather during their planned 5-day hunt, with moderate temperatures and light winds that would make hunting comfortable and safe. When they reached their destination in the late afternoon, Marcus anchored the boat in a protected cove about 2 miles from the mouth of the salmon stream, where they planned to hunt. The area was pristine wilderness with no signs of human activity, surrounded by dense forests of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that rose from the water's edge to peaks shrouded in clouds and mist. They set up a comfortable camp on a gravel beach near the stream mouth, using a large military surplus tent and portable stove that would provide shelter and hot meals throughout their stay. The first 3 days of hunting were productive and uneventful, with both men spotting numerous black bears feeding along the stream and on salmon carcasses scattered throughout the riparian zone. Warren was able to take a nice 6-foot boar on the second day, a beautiful animal with a glossy black coat and impressive skull that would make an excellent trophy. Marcus was pleased with the success of the hunt and the quality of the bears they were seeing, confirming his assessment that this remote valley offered some of the best bear hunting in southeast Alaska. But on their 4th night in camp, something happened that changed Marcus's understanding of the wilderness he thought he knew so well. They had spent the evening processing Warren's bear and preparing the hide and skull for transport, working by the light of their camp lanterns as darkness fell over the valley. The night was unusually quiet, with none of the normal sounds of wind in the trees or small animals moving through the underbrush that typically provided a constant background noise. In the forest, around midnight, as they were preparing to turn in for the night, they began to hear something moving through the forest around their camp. At first, it sounded like a large animal, possibly another bear, crashing through the dense vegetation and making no attempt to move quietly. But as Marcus listened more carefully, he realized that whatever was out there was moving in a way that did not match the behavior patterns of any animal he knew. The sounds seemed to follow a deliberate path around their camp, as if something was circling them and studying their position. Warren grabbed his rifle and asked Marcus if they should investigate, but the older guide shook his head and indicated they should remain in their tent and wait to see what developed. Marcus had encountered curious bears around hunting camps before, and his standard procedure was to avoid confrontation unless the animals showed aggressive behavior or attempted to get into their food supplies. Most bears would investigate a camp briefly and then move on once they determined there was no easy access to food or other attractants. But whatever was circling their camp showed no signs of losing interest or moving on to other areas. The sounds continued for over an hour, with the creature maintaining a consistent distance of about 50 yards from their tent, while moving through vegetation so thick that it should have been nearly impossible for any large animal to navigate. Even more disturbing, Marcus began to hear vocalizations that did not match any sounds he had heard from bears, wolves, or other wildlife in the area. The sounds were deep and guttural, but also strangely articulated, almost like attempts at speech or communication. Around 2 a.m, the circling stopped and was replaced by a silence that was even more unsettling than the sounds had been. Marcus and Warren lay in their sleeping bags with their rifles at hand, straining to hear any indication of where the creature might be or what it was doing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by their own breathing and the distant sound of water flowing in the salmon stream. Then they heard footsteps. Not the sounds of an animal moving through the forest, but clearly identifiable footsteps of something walking upright on 2 legs. The steps were slow and deliberate, suggesting something much larger and heavier than a human being, and they seemed to be approaching their tent from the direction of the stream. Marcus had heard stories of Sasquatch encounters from other hunters and guides, but he had always dismissed such accounts as misidentifications of bears or other known animals seen under poor conditions. The footsteps continued for several minutes, coming closer to their camp with each step. Marcus could hear branches breaking and vegetation being pushed aside as something large forced its way through the dense forest understory. The sound of breathing became audible, deep, and raspy inhalations that suggested lung capacity far greater than any human. Most terrifying of all, Marcus could smell something that reminded him of a wet dog mixed with the musky odor of a large predator, a scent so strong it penetrated the walls of their tent. Warren whispered that he was going to look outside and see what was approaching their camp, but Marcus grabbed his arm and shook his head firmly. Whatever was out there was clearly much larger and more powerful than either man, and Marcus's instincts told him that their best chance of survival was to remain hidden and hope the creature would lose interest and move on. Confrontation with something that could move through dense forest, like it was open ground, would likely end badly for 2 middle-aged men armed only with hunting rifles. The footsteps stopped just outside their tent, so close that Marcus could hear the creature's breathing and feel the vibrations of its movements through the ground. For several minutes, nothing happened except the sound of deep, regular breathing and occasional rustling as the creature shifted position. Marcus had the distinct impression that it was studying their tent and trying to determine what was inside, displaying intelligence and curiosity that went far beyond simple animal behavior. Then, the creature began to circle their tent, moving slowly and deliberately, while maintaining a distance of only a few feet from the walls. Marcus and Warren could track its movement by the sound of footsteps and breathing, realizing with growing horror that they were being examined by something that showed no fear of humans or their equipment. The creature's breathing became more rapid and excited as it circled, suggesting arousal or anticipation that made both men fear they were being evaluated as potential prey. After what felt like an eternity, the creature stopped directly behind their tent and began making new sounds that chilled Marcus to the bone. The vocalizations were clearly attempts at mimicking human speech, crude approximations of words and phrases that suggested the creature had observed humans before and was attempting some form of communication. The sounds were distorted and alien, like hearing human voices played backward or filtered through water, but they contained enough recognizable elements to be deeply unsettling. The creature seemed to be repeating sounds it had heard from Marcus and Warren earlier in the evening, crude imitations of their voices discussing their hunting plans and their preparations for the following day. But the repetitions were not exact, as if the creature was experimenting with different variations and trying to understand the meaning behind the sounds it was mimicking. Most disturbing of all, Marcus realized that the creature had been close enough to their camp throughout the evening to hear and remember their conversations. Dawn finally brought relief as the creature's vocalizations faded and the sounds of its movement disappeared into the dense forest surrounding their camp. Marcus and Warren emerged from their tent to find clear evidence that their encounter had been real, rather than a shared nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. The ground around their tent was marked with footprints that were clearly humanoid, but much larger than any human foot, with impressions that showed toes and an arch structure, but were nearly twice the size of Warren's size 11 boots. The creature had also left other signs of its presence, including broken branches at a height of 8 to 10 feet and claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. Most unsettling of all, Marcus found evidence that the creature had been observing their camp from multiple locations throughout their stay, with several spots where vegetation had been flattened to create viewing positions that offered clear sight lines to their tent and equipment. Marcus made the decision to end their hunt immediately and return to Ketchikan, despite having 2 days remaining on their planned trip. Both men felt profoundly unsettled by their encounter, and no longer felt safe sleeping in the remote valley where they had been stalked by something that defied rational explanation. They broke camp quickly and loaded their gear into the skiff, eager to reach the safety of civilization and put distance between themselves and whatever had visited them during the night. The journey back to Ketchikan was accomplished in record time, with Marcus pushing his boat to its maximum speed and making only essential stops for fuel. Neither man spoke much during the trip, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced and what it might mean for their understanding of the Alaskan wilderness. Warren asked Marcus not to discuss the encounter with other clients or guides, fearing that such stories would damage his reputation as a serious hunter and outdoor enthusiast. Marcus agreed to keep the encounter private, but the experience fundamentally changed his approach to guiding hunters in remote areas of southeast Alaska. He began requiring clients to carry more sophisticated communication equipment and emergency supplies, and he avoided camping in areas that were too far from boat access or potential rescue. Most significantly, he developed new protocols for dealing with unknown wildlife encounters that emphasized avoiding confrontation and prioritizing client safety over hunting success. For Warren, the encounter ended his decades-long tradition of hunting in Alaska. He returned to his home in the lower 48 and never again ventured into wilderness areas where he might be confronted with creatures that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. The experience had shaken his confidence in his ability to survive in truly remote environments and left him with a lasting respect for the mysteries that still inhabited the deepest wilderness areas of Alaska. The incident remained a closely guarded secret between Marcus and Warren for many years, shared only with their immediate families and a few trusted friends who could be counted on to treat the account with appropriate seriousness. Both men understood that their encounter represented something significant and potentially dangerous, but they also recognized that sharing such stories publicly would likely result in ridicule rather than serious investigation of the phenomena they had witnessed. Like a lot of experienced trappers who made their living in Alaska's remote interior, Kenneth Morrison had been setting trap lines through the brutal winter months for over 30 years and thought he understood every danger that the frozen wilderness could present to those brave enough to work its trap lines. He had survived temperatures that dropped to 60 below zero, navigated whiteout blizzards that could disorient even veteran outdoorsmen, and dealt with equipment failures that would have killed less experienced trappers who did not carry the right backup gear or possess the survival skills necessary to stay alive when everything went wrong. For trappers like Kenneth, who worked hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, winter was not just a season but a life or death test that separated the truly competent from those who were merely lucky. As anyone who has run trap lines in interior Alaska knows, the combination of extreme cold, unpredictable weather, and vast distances creates conditions where a single mistake or moment of bad judgment can quickly become fatal. Some very close calls had occurred among trappers working the remote areas around Fairbanks over the years, with experienced men disappearing without a trace or being found weeks later frozen to death in their cabins or along their trap lines. The isolation and harsh conditions that made trapping profitable also made it incredibly dangerous, and even veteran trappers occasionally pushed their luck too far or encountered situations that tested the limits of human endurance. And Kenneth was exactly the kind of trapper who took every precaution seriously, carrying redundant safety equipment and following protocols that had been developed through decades of hard-won experience in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth. I think it helped that Kenneth had learned trapping from his father Donald, who had been working trap lines in Alaska since the 1950s, and had passed down not only the technical skills required for successful trapping, but also the survival knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death when conditions deteriorated rapidly. Donald had taught Kenneth to respect the winter and to always assume that something would go wrong during every trip into the backcountry, preparing contingency plans and carrying emergency supplies that might seem excessive to outsiders, but had saved his life on multiple occasions. One aspect of Kenneth's operation that set him apart from other trappers was his partnership with his younger brother Gary, who helped maintain the extensive trap line that covered over 200 square miles of remote wilderness south of Fairbanks. Gary was 15 years younger than Kenneth, but had been working trap lines since he was a teenager and possessed the same respect for the winter and the same commitment to safety protocols that had kept their family safe for decades. The brothers worked as a team, with Kenneth handling the more remote sections of their trap line, while Gary managed the areas closer to their base camp and served as backup in case of emergencies. Kenneth and Gary had planned their final trapping expedition of the season for late March, when the fur prices were at their peak, but the weather was still cold enough to keep their trap lines productive. Their destination was a remote cabin they had built about 80 miles southeast of Fairbanks, in an area that was accessible only by snowmobile during the winter months, and offered excellent trapping opportunities for lynx, wolverine, and other valuable fur-bearing animals. The cabin served as their base of operations during extended trapping trips, and was stocked with enough food and fuel to sustain both men for weeks if necessary. They set out from Fairbanks on a clear morning in late March, when temperatures were hovering around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to ensure good travel conditions, but not so cold as to make working outdoors dangerous with proper clothing and equipment. Their plan was to spend 10 days checking and resetting their trap lines, processing any animals they had caught, and preparing their equipment for storage until the following season. They traveled on powerful Arctic Cat snowmobiles, pulling cargo sleds loaded with supplies, spare parts, and the specialized equipment required for successful trapping in extreme conditions. The 80-mile journey to their remote cabin normally took about 4 hours over terrain that included frozen swamps, steep ridges, and several creek crossings where ice conditions had to be carefully evaluated before proceeding. Kenneth led the way on his more powerful machine, while Gary followed on a smaller snowmobile, both of them using GPS units and traditional navigation techniques to stay on course through wilderness where getting lost could quickly become fatal. The weather remained clear and calm during their journey, with no indication of the storm system that was approaching from the Gulf of Alaska. When they arrived at their cabin in the early afternoon, everything appeared normal, and their supplies were intact despite being unattended for several weeks. The cabin was a solid structure built from local logs and designed to withstand the extreme weather conditions of interior Alaska, with a wood-burning stove that could keep the interior comfortable even when outside temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. Kenneth and Gary spent the remainder of their first day unloading supplies, checking their equipment, and planning their trapping routes for the following days. The first indication that their trip might become more challenging than expected came on their second day, when Kenneth noticed subtle changes in weather conditions that suggested a major storm system was approaching the area. The clear skies and calm winds of their arrival were being replaced by high cirrus clouds and increasing wind speeds that veteran outdoorsmen recognized as precursors to severe weather. More concerning, Kenneth's barometer was showing a rapid drop in atmospheric pressure that indicated a powerful low-pressure system was moving through the region. Gary wanted to continue with their planned trapping activities and wait to see how the weather developed, but Kenneth's experience told him they should consider cutting their trip short and returning to Fairbanks before conditions deteriorated further. He had been caught in severe storms during previous trapping expeditions and knew how quickly travel could become impossible when visibility dropped to zero and wind speeds made snowmobile operation dangerous or impossible. The decision to leave early would cost them money and lost trapping opportunities, but Kenneth understood that no amount of fur was worth risking their lives. But before they could implement their emergency departure plans, the storm hit with a fury that surprised even Kenneth's experienced assessment of the weather conditions. What had been light snow and moderate winds quickly escalated into a full blizzard with wind speeds that Kenneth estimated at over 60 miles per hour and snowfall so heavy that visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. The temperature plummeted from -10 to -35 degrees in a matter of hours, creating wind chill factors that would cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. The brothers were forced to take shelter in their cabin while the storm raged outside, consuming firewood at an alarming rate to maintain interior temperatures warm enough to prevent hypothermia. Kenneth monitored weather conditions using his battery-powered radio, receiving reports that the storm was much more severe and long-lasting than meteorologists had predicted. Instead of moving through the area in 12 to 18 hours as forecast, the blizzard appeared to be stalled over interior Alaska and could continue for several days. By their fourth day in the cabin, Kenneth realized they were facing a genuine survival situation. Their firewood supply, which should have been adequate for their planned 10-day trip, was being consumed much faster than expected due to the extreme cold and constant wind that pulled heat from the cabin. More critically, their food supplies were running low because they had planned to supplement their provisions by hunting small game during their trapping activities. The storm made any outdoor activity impossible, and they were forced to ration their remaining food while hoping the weather would improve soon enough to allow them to return to Fairbanks. On their fifth day, the situation became critical when Kenneth discovered that the extreme cold had caused problems with their snowmobiles that might prevent them from leaving even when the weather improved. The battery on Gary's machine had frozen and cracked, while Kenneth's snowmobile was showing signs of fuel line problems that could cause engine failure during the long journey back to civilization. Without reliable transportation, they would be stranded at their remote cabin with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. Kenneth made the difficult decision to attempt emergency repairs on their snowmobiles using spare parts and improvised solutions that might allow at least one machine to function well enough to carry both men back to Fairbanks. Working in the bitter cold and driving wind, he spent hours trying to bypass the damaged fuel lines and jury-rig a starting system that did not depend on the frozen battery. Gary assisted with the repairs while also maintaining their fire and rationing their remaining food supplies. By their seventh day, Kenneth had managed to get his snowmobile running with improvised repairs that might last long enough to reach safety, but he was not confident the machine would survive the entire 80-mile journey under severe weather conditions. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted, and they were burning furniture and other cabin materials to keep their fire going, as their firewood supply dwindled to nothing. Most critically, both men were showing early signs of malnutrition and exhaustion that would make travel increasingly dangerous, even if their snowmobile continued to function. The storm finally began to subside on their 8th day, with wind speeds dropping and snowfall becoming intermittent rather than continuous. Kenneth recognized this as their only opportunity to attempt the journey back to Fairbanks before their physical condition deteriorated further, or their improvised snowmobile repairs failed completely. They loaded their essential gear onto Kenneth's machine and abandoned most of their trapping equipment and supplies, focusing only on carrying the emergency items they would need if they became stranded during the journey. The trip back to Fairbanks became a desperate race against time and equipment failure, with Kenneth's jury-rigged snowmobile threatening to break down completely at several points during the journey. They were forced to stop frequently, to make additional repairs, and to rest when exhaustion made it dangerous to continue traveling. Gary rode behind Kenneth on the single snowmobile, both men sharing body heat and taking turns driving when fatigue made concentration difficult. About halfway back to Fairbanks, Kenneth's improvised fuel system finally failed completely, leaving them stranded in the wilderness with no transportation and limited emergency supplies. They were still more than 40 miles from the nearest settlement, too far to walk in their weakened condition and harsh weather. Kenneth activated his emergency beacon and began preparing a survival shelter using materials from their disabled snowmobile and natural resources available in their immediate area. The rescue that followed was complicated by continuing poor weather and the remote location where Kenneth and Gary were, stranded. Alaska State Troopers and volunteer search teams spent 2 days locating the brothers and organizing a helicopter rescue that could operate safely in the marginal weather conditions. When rescuers finally reached them, both men were suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, but were conscious and able to assist in their own evacuation. Kenneth spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from his ordeal, while Gary required surgery to treat frostbite damage to several fingers and toes. Both men made full recoveries, but the experience ended their careers as trappers and left them with a deep respect for the power of Alaska's winter weather to transform routine expeditions into life-threatening survival situations. Kenneth sold his trapping equipment and moved to a warmer climate, while Gary took a job that kept him close to Fairbanks and never again ventured into the remote wilderness during winter months. The incident served as a reminder to the trapping community that even experienced outdoorsmen could be overwhelmed by the extreme conditions that characterize Alaska's winter climate. Kenneth's survival was largely attributed to his extensive emergency preparations and his willingness to abandon valuable equipment when survival became the priority. The experience reinforced the importance of carrying redundant safety equipment, maintaining conservative safety margins, and recognizing when conditions had deteriorated beyond the point where continuation of planned activities became too dangerous to justify. For both brothers, the experience provided sobering insight into how quickly routine activities could become deadly when multiple factors combined to create perfect storm conditions. Their survival depended not only on their technical skills and emergency equipment, but also on their ability to make difficult decisions under extreme stress and to work together effectively when their lives depended on coordination and mutual support. The knowledge that they had come within hours of freezing to death in their remote cabin became a permanent reminder of the thin margin that separates successful wilderness operations from tragedy in Alaska's unforgiving climate. Like a lot of people who came to Alaska chasing dreams of striking it rich, Eddie Patterson had spent years searching for gold in the remote creeks and valleys of the interior, convinced that the big strike was just around the next bend or over the next ridge. He had been prospecting in Alaska since the early 1990s, working small claims, and following rumors of untapped placer deposits in areas where the old-timers had given up decades earlier. For prospectors like Eddie, who lived out of their trucks and spent months at a time in the backcountry, Alaska was not just a place to find gold, but a way of life that offered freedom from the constraints and complications of modern society. As anyone who has spent serious time prospecting in Alaska knows, the search for gold is as much about the adventure and independence as it is about the potential financial rewards. And many prospectors continue working marginal claims long after it becomes clear that they will never strike it rich. Some very strange disappearances had occurred among prospectors working the remote areas around Fairbanks over the years, with experienced miners vanishing from their claims without a trace and leaving behind equipment, supplies, and personal belongings that suggested they had not planned to leave permanently. The combination of isolation, dangerous working conditions, and the secretive nature of many prospecting operations made it difficult for authorities to determine whether missing prospectors had met with accidents, decided to move on to new areas, or encountered something more sinister in the wilderness. And Eddie was exactly the kind of prospector who kept to himself and avoided drawing attention to his activities, preferring to work alone and share information about his operations only with a few trusted friends who understood the importance of discretion in the competitive world of gold mining. I think it helped that Eddie had built a reputation among the prospecting community as a careful and methodical miner who did his research and approached each new claim with the systematic thoroughness that separated successful prospectors from weekend hobbyists. He was known for his ability to read geological formations and identify promising areas that had been overlooked by previous miners, and his small-scale operations had produced enough gold over the years to fund his simple lifestyle and continued prospecting activities. Other miners respected his knowledge and occasionally sought his advice about equipment, techniques, and claim selection. One person who knew Eddie well was a fellow prospector named Jerry Townsend, who had been working claims in Alaska for over 20 years and had developed a friendship with Eddie based on their shared passion for mining and their similar approach to life in the backcountry. Jerry was one of the few people that Eddie trusted with detailed information about his prospecting activities, and they often shared tips about promising areas and warned each other about claims that had proven unproductive or presented unusual dangers. Eddie and Jerry had been discussing a remote area about 100 miles northeast of Fairbanks that showed geological characteristics suggesting the possibility of significant placer deposits that had never been properly explored by modern mining techniques. The area was accessible only by small aircraft or long overland journeys during the summer months, and its isolation had deterred most prospectors from investing the time and resources necessary for a thorough evaluation. But Eddie had been researching the area for months, studying geological surveys and historical mining records that suggested previous miners had barely scratched the surface of the region's potential. In late June, Eddie informed Jerry that he was planning a solo prospecting trip to investigate several promising creeks in the remote area they had discussed. His plan was to spend 3 weeks evaluating the ground, taking samples, and determining whether the area justified the expense and effort of establishing a more permanent mining operation. Eddie was well equipped for extended backcountry work, with a reliable 4-wheel drive truck, camping equipment rated for Alaska conditions, and prospecting gear that would allow him to evaluate potential claims systematically and thoroughly. Jerry offered to accompany Eddie on the expedition, but Eddie preferred to work alone during initial evaluations and promised to share his findings when he returned to Fairbanks in mid-July. They agreed that Jerry would contact authorities if Eddie failed to return by a specified date, as both men understood the importance of having someone who knew their whereabouts and could initiate search efforts if something went wrong. Eddie left detailed information about his planned route and intended areas of operation, along with copies of his research materials and geological maps. The area Eddie was planning to investigate was truly remote wilderness, consisting of rugged terrain covered by dense forest and crossed by numerous streams and creeks that showed the geological characteristics associated with gold-bearing gravels. The region had been lightly prospected during the early gold rush years, but most of the historical mining activity had been concentrated along the larger rivers, where transportation and supply problems were more manageable. Eddie believed that the smaller tributary streams had been largely ignored and might contain significant deposits that could be worked profitably with modern equipment and techniques. Eddie's truck was found 3 weeks later by a group of hunters who were exploring the area and noticed the vehicle parked at what appeared to be an abandoned campsite near one of the creeks Eddie had planned to investigate. The truck was unlocked and contained most of Eddie's personal belongings, including his wallet, identification, and detailed prospecting logs that documented his activities during the first 2 weeks of his expedition. His prospecting equipment was missing, suggesting that he had been working somewhere in the area when whatever happened to him occurred. The discovery of Eddie's abandoned truck prompted an immediate search and rescue operation coordinated by Alaska state troopers and involving volunteers from the prospecting community who knew the area and understood the techniques and equipment Eddie would have been using. The searchers followed his documented activities and found evidence of his prospecting work at several locations along the creek system, including test pits, sample sites, and equipment caches that indicated he had been conducting a systematic evaluation of the area's gold potential. But about a mile upstream from his truck, the searchers found something that made the investigation much more disturbing. Eddie's prospecting equipment was scattered across a gravel bar in a pattern that suggested it had been thrown around with tremendous force rather than simply dropped or abandoned. His metal detector was twisted and bent as if something with incredible strength had crushed it, while his gold pan and other tools were scattered over a wide area and showed damage that could not be explained by normal use or accidental dropping. More concerning was the evidence of a struggle that was clearly visible in the soft sand and gravel of the creek bank. The area showed signs of violent disturbance, with deep gouges in the earth and scattered debris that suggested a confrontation between Eddie and something that was much larger and more powerful than a human being. Most disturbing of all, the searchers found large tracks pressed into the mud near the creek, footprints that were clearly humanoid, but much larger than anything that could have been made by Eddie or any normal person. The tracks were nearly 18 inches long and showed the impression of toes and an arch structure that suggested a foot, but the size and depth of the impressions indicated something that weighed far more than any human. The stride length between tracks suggested something that stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall, and the depth of the impressions in the soft ground indicated a weight of several hundred pounds. Most unsettling of all, the tracks showed claw marks at the tips of what should have been toes, suggesting something that was not entirely human, despite the humanoid foot structure. Jerry joined the search efforts and was able to provide investigators with additional insight into Eddie's methods and likely behavior patterns. Based on his knowledge of Eddie's prospecting techniques, Jerry believed that Eddie had been working his way systematically upstream, testing gravel deposits and following geological indicators that suggested the presence of gold-bearing deposits. The location where his equipment was found, scattered, represented the furthest point of his documented progress, suggesting that whatever happened to him had occurred while he was working in that specific area. The search for Eddie continued for 2 weeks, with teams of volunteers and professional searchers combing every valley, creek, and ridge within miles of where his equipment had been found. Aircraft overflights covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness, looking for any sign of Eddie or additional evidence that might explain his disappearance. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, but the handlers reported unusual behavior from the animals, with several dogs refusing to follow certain tracks or showing signs of extreme agitation when approaching particular areas. During the extended search operation, several searchers reported strange encounters that suggested something unusual was present in the area where Eddie had disappeared. Multiple teams reported hearing sounds that did not match any known wildlife, including vocalizations that seemed almost human, but were distorted and amplified beyond anything that could come from a person. One team reported finding additional large tracks similar to those discovered near Eddie's scattered equipment, but these tracks were found miles away from the original site and appeared to be much more recent. The official search was eventually called off when no additional evidence was found and resources were needed for other emergencies. But Jerry and several other prospectors continued private search efforts for months afterward. Their investigations uncovered additional disturbing evidence, including more locations where the large humanoid tracks were found, and areas where vegetation had been disturbed in ways that suggested the passage of something much larger and more powerful than any known wildlife species. Some of these sites showed signs of what appeared to be feeding activity, with animal remains scattered in patterns that suggested consumption by something with enormous strength and different feeding habits than any known predator. Local native Alaskan elders, when quietly approached about the disappearance and the strange evidence that had been found, nodded knowingly and spoke of ancient stories about creatures they called the Tornersuk, massive beings that were part human and part animal and lived in the deepest wilderness areas where they guarded ancient territories against human intrusion. According to their traditions, these creatures were extremely territorial and would attack anyone who ventured too far into their domain or disturbed places that were sacred to them. The elders suggested that Eddie might have unknowingly violated some ancient boundary or disturbed a site that was protected by these legendary guardians. The investigation into Eddie's disappearance remains officially open, but no additional evidence has been found despite occasional reports from hunters and other prospectors who claim to have encountered large humanoid tracks or heard strange vocalizations in remote areas of interior Alaska. Jerry eventually gave up prospecting and moved to a smaller community closer to Anchorage, claiming that he no longer felt safe working alone in the remote areas where he had spent most of his adult life. Other prospectors quietly began working in pairs or groups rather than venturing into the backcountry alone, and several miners reported abandoning promising claims in areas where they had found the large tracks or experienced unexplained phenomena. For Jerry and the other prospectors who knew Eddie, his disappearance served as a stark reminder that Alaska's wilderness still harbored mysteries and dangers that existed beyond conventional understanding. The evidence found at the site of his disappearance suggested an encounter with something that was not documented by science, but was well known to the indigenous peoples who had lived in Alaska for thousands of years. The knowledge that experienced prospectors could simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only scattered equipment and massive tracks, became a source of ongoing concern for anyone who worked alone in the remote areas where gold might be found. But other, more dangerous treasures were also hidden. Eddie's disappearance became part of the unofficial folklore shared among Alaska's prospecting community, a cautionary tale about the risks of working alone in areas that might be protected by guardians that did not welcome human intrusion. His fate remained unknown, but the evidence suggested that he had encountered something in the wilderness that was far more dangerous than bears, wolves, or any other recognized threat that prospectors normally prepared for when venturing into Alaska's remote interior in search of gold and adventure. Like a lot of experienced mountaineers who came to Alaska seeking the ultimate climbing challenges, Victoria Chen had conquered peaks all over the world and thought she understood the risks and dangers that came with high-altitude expeditions in extreme conditions. She'd climbed in the Himalayas, the Andes, and the European Alps, accumulating years of experience dealing with altitude sickness, unpredictable weather, and technical climbing problems that could kill the unprepared or unlucky. For climbers like Victoria, who made their living guiding expeditions and writing about mountaineering adventures, Alaska represented the final frontier, where the combination of extreme weather, remote locations, and challenging terrain created conditions that tested even the most experienced alpine athletes. As anyone who has attempted serious climbing in the Alaska Range knows, the mountains there are not just tall but actively hostile, with weather patterns that can change from perfect climbing conditions to life-threatening storms in a matter of hours. Some very close calls had occurred among climbing expeditions in the remote areas around Denali over the years, with experienced mountaineers disappearing in crevasses, getting caught in avalanches, or simply vanishing during storms that made search and rescue operations impossible for days or weeks. The combination of extreme altitude, brutal weather, and vast distances from help made mountaineering in Alaska one of the most dangerous pursuits on Earth, and even veteran climbers occasionally pushed their luck too far or encountered conditions that exceeded their ability to survive. And Victoria was exactly the kind of climber who took every precaution seriously, carrying redundant safety equipment and following protocols that had been developed through decades of hard-won experience on some of the world's most challenging peaks. I think it helped that Victoria had learned mountaineering from her mentor, Jonathan Hayes, a legendary climber who had been guiding expeditions in Alaska since the 1980s and had survived more close calls and dangerous situations than any other guide working the Alaska Range. Jonathan had passed down not only the technical skills required for successful high-altitude climbing, but also the judgment and risk assessment abilities that could mean the difference between life and death when conditions deteriorated rapidly. Victoria valued this old-school approach and combined it with modern equipment and communication technology to create a systematic approach to expedition planning that had kept her clients safe through dozens of challenging climbs. One regular climbing partner who accompanied Victoria on her most ambitious expeditions was a younger climber named Thomas Riley, who had moved to Alaska from Colorado, specifically to tackle the technical challenges and extreme conditions that the state's mountains offered. Thomas was in his early 30s, in peak physical condition, and had extensive experience with cold weather mountaineering, but he lacked the specific knowledge of Alaskan conditions and weather patterns that could mean the difference between a successful climb and a fatal disaster. Victoria had been mentoring Thomas for 2 years, gradually introducing him to more challenging routes and more remote locations as his skills and experience developed. Victoria and Thomas had been planning an ambitious attempt on an unnamed peak in a remote section of the Alaska Range, a technically challenging climb that had been attempted only twice before and never successfully completed due to the combination of difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, and extreme isolation from potential rescue operations. The mountain, which climbers referred to as Devil's Ridge due to its knife-edge summit approach and reputation for claiming lives, rose over 14,000 feet and required advanced technical climbing skills as well as the ability to survive in conditions that regularly dropped to 40 below zero. They planned their expedition for late April, when the weather was typically more stable than during the winter months, but snow conditions were still solid enough to support safe travel across the glaciated approaches to the mountain. Their route would require 2 weeks of hiking and skiing across remote wilderness just to reach the base of the mountain, followed by another week of technical climbing to reach the summit and return to their base camp. They carried enough food and fuel for a month in case weather conditions prevented their planned return schedule. The journey to the base of Devil's Ridge took 10 days of difficult travel across terrain that included crevassed glaciers, steep mountain passes, and areas where avalanche danger required careful route selection and timing. Victoria and Thomas traveled on cross-country skis pulling cargo sleds loaded with climbing equipment, camping gear, and the specialized cold weather gear necessary for survival at high altitude in Arctic conditions. The weather remained relatively stable during their approach, with cold but clear conditions that allowed them to make good progress toward their objective. When they reached their planned base camp at the foot of Devil's Ridge, Victoria was pleased with their progress and the condition of both climbers after the challenging approach. Thomas had handled the difficult travel well and showed no signs of the fatigue or altitude-related problems that sometimes affected climbers who were not fully acclimatized to the conditions they would face on the mountain itself. Their equipment was functioning properly, and their food and fuel supplies were adequate for their planned climbing schedule with comfortable safety margins. The first 3 days of climbing went according to their carefully planned schedule, with Victoria and Thomas making steady progress up the lower slopes of Devil's Ridge while establishing camps and fixing ropes on the most technical sections of their route. The mountain lived up to its reputation for difficulty, with several pitches of nearly vertical ice climbing and rock sections that required advanced technical skills. But both climbers were performing well, and the weather remained stable enough to allow safe upward progress. But on their 4th day on the mountain, Victoria began to notice subtle changes in weather conditions that made her increasingly concerned about their safety. The clear, cold conditions they had enjoyed during their approach and initial climbing were being replaced by increasing wind speeds and the kind of high, thin clouds that veteran Alaskan climbers recognized as precursors to severe storms. More troubling, Victoria's altimeter was showing rapid changes in atmospheric pressure that indicated a powerful weather system was approaching the area. Thomas wanted to continue climbing and attempt to reach the summit before conditions deteriorated further, arguing that they had invested too much time and effort in the expedition to turn back when they were within striking distance of their objective. But Victoria's experience told her that they should descend immediately and establish a secure base camp position where they could wait out whatever weather was approaching. She had been caught in severe storms during previous Alaskan expeditions and knew how quickly conditions could become life-threatening at high altitude. Victoria's concerns proved to be well-founded when the weather system hit Devil's Ridge with a fury that exceeded even her experienced assessment of the warning signs they had observed. What had been moderate winds and light snow quickly escalated into a full Arctic storm with wind speeds that Victoria estimated at over 80 miles per hour and snowfall so heavy that visibility was reduced to less than 5 feet. The temperature plummeted from -10 degrees to -40 degrees in a matter of hours, creating wind chill factors that would cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes. The climbers were forced to take emergency shelter in a hastily constructed snow cave on a narrow ledge about halfway up the mountain, where they huddled in their sleeping bags while the storm raged outside. Victoria used her avalanche beacon to monitor weather conditions and communicate with their base camp, but the severe conditions made radio communication difficult and intermittent. More critically, their position on the exposed mountain face left them vulnerable to avalanches and rockfall that the high winds were triggering throughout the area. By their 2nd day, trapped in the snow cave, Victoria realized they were facing a genuine survival emergency. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and their position on the mountain was becoming increasingly dangerous as wind-driven snow began to block their shelter and threatened to bury them alive. Their fuel supplies, which had been calculated for normal climbing conditions, were being consumed much faster than expected as they struggled to maintain body temperature in the extreme cold and howling wind. More critically, Thomas was beginning to show signs of altitude sickness and hypothermia that made Victoria doubt his ability to attempt the dangerous descent that would be required to reach safety. His speech was becoming slurred and confused, and he was showing the poor judgment and irrational behavior that indicated his brain was being affected by the combination of thin air, extreme cold, and the stress of their survival situation. Victoria realized that she might have to attempt a rescue descent while managing a partner who was becoming increasingly incapable of making rational decisions or following safety protocols. On their third day in the snow cave, the situation became critical when Thomas lost consciousness, and Victoria was unable to wake him despite her attempts at warming him and providing emergency medical care with their limited first aid supplies. His breathing became shallow and irregular, and Victoria realized that he was entering the final stages of hypothermia and would die within hours unless she could somehow get him to lower altitude and warmer conditions. Victoria made the desperate decision to attempt an emergency descent with Thomas, despite the continuing storm and the extreme danger of moving on the mountain under such conditions. Using techniques she had learned during rescue training, she rigged a system that would allow her to lower Thomas down the mountain while rappelling herself. But the process would be incredibly dangerous and physically demanding under the best of conditions. In the middle of a severe storm, with near zero visibility and life-threatening wind speeds, the attempt bordered on suicide. The descent became a nightmarish battle against the elements and against time as Victoria fought to keep Thomas alive while navigating down technical terrain that was made exponentially more dangerous by the storm conditions. Several times during the descent, avalanches triggered by the wind and new snowfall swept across their route, and Victoria was forced to take shelter and wait for conditions to stabilize before continuing. The process that should have taken a few hours under normal conditions stretched into an entire day of life-or-death struggle. Victoria finally reached their base camp after 18 hours of continuous effort, with Thomas barely conscious and showing signs of severe frostbite on his hands and feet. She immediately activated their emergency beacon and began providing what medical care she could with their camp supplies, but it was clear that Thomas needed immediate evacuation to a hospital if he was going to survive. The storm was still raging and made helicopter rescue impossible, forcing Victoria to continue treating Thomas while hoping that conditions would improve enough to allow rescue operations. The emergency beacon signal was received by rescue coordinators in Anchorage, but the severe weather conditions prevented any immediate response. Victoria spent 2 more days providing emergency medical care to Thomas, while dealing with her own exhaustion and frostbite injuries from the harrowing descent. She managed to keep Thomas alive by sharing body heat, rationing their remaining fuel to provide warmth, and using their emergency food supplies to maintain their strength during the ordeal. When the storm finally broke on the 6th day, a helicopter rescue team was able to reach their base camp and evacuate both climbers to a hospital in Anchorage. Thomas required surgery to save several fingers and toes that had been severely frostbitten during their ordeal, while Victoria was treated for exhaustion, dehydration, and less severe cold injuries. Both climbers made full recoveries, but the experience ended Thomas's mountaineering career and left Victoria with a profound respect for the power of Alaskan weather to transform routine climbs into life-threatening emergencies. The rescue operation became a case study in emergency procedures and survival techniques, with Victoria's actions during the descent and subsequent care of her injured partner cited as examples of how proper training and equipment could make the difference between life and death in extreme conditions. Her decision to descend in the middle of the storm, while dangerous, was ultimately credited with saving Thomas's life by getting him to lower altitude before his condition deteriorated beyond recovery. For Victoria, the experience reinforced the harsh reality that Alaska's mountains operated according to their own rules and timetable, and even the most experienced climbers could find themselves at the mercy of weather systems that exceeded human ability to predict or prepare for. Her experience on Devil's Ridge became a reminder that mountaineering in Alaska required not only technical skills and physical conditioning, but also the judgment to recognize when conditions had deteriorated beyond the point where continuation of climbing activities became too dangerous to justify. The incident led to improvements in emergency communication equipment and rescue procedures for expeditions operating in remote areas of the Alaska Range, and Victoria became an advocate for better weather monitoring and evacuation planning for climbers attempting challenging routes in extreme conditions. Her survival story served as both inspiration and warning for other mountaineers who were drawn to Alaska's peaks by their reputation for offering the ultimate test of climbing skills and survival abilities. Like a lot of veteran snowmobilers who grew up exploring Alaska's vast winter wilderness, Christopher Vaughn had been riding the remote trails and untracked backcountry around Fairbanks for over 15 years and thought he knew every danger that the frozen landscape could present to those who ventured far from civilization during the long Alaskan winter. He had survived blizzards that reduced visibility to zero, navigated treacherous river crossings where thin ice could plunge a snowmobile and rider into deadly water, and dealt with mechanical breakdowns in temperatures that could kill an unprepared person in a matter of hours. For snowmobilers like Christopher, who used their machines not just for recreation, but as essential transportation to remote cabins and work sites, winter riding was a necessary skill that separated longtime Alaskans from newcomers who underestimated the challenges of traveling across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. As anyone who has spent serious time snowmobiling in interior Alaska knows, the combination of extreme cold, unpredictable weather, and vast distances from help creates conditions where even minor mistakes or equipment failures can quickly become life-threatening emergencies. Some very disturbing disappearances had occurred among snowmobilers working the remote areas around Fairbanks over the years, with experienced riders vanishing without a trace on routes they had traveled safely dozens of times before. The harsh winter conditions and scavenging animals quickly eliminated most evidence of accidents or mechanical failures, making it difficult for search teams to determine what had happened to missing riders or where their remains might be located. And Christopher was exactly the kind of snowmobiler who took every precaution seriously, carrying emergency survival gear and following safety protocols that had been developed through decades of hard-won experience in some of the most challenging winter conditions on Earth. I think it helped that Christopher had learned snowmobiling from his uncle Raymond, who had been riding in Alaska since the 1970s and had survived more close calls and dangerous situations than any other rider in the Fairbanks area. Raymond had passed down not only the technical skills required for safe winter travel, but also the judgment and risk assessment abilities that could mean the difference between life and death when conditions deteriorated rapidly or equipment failed in remote locations. Christopher valued this old-school approach and combined it with modern GPS technology and communication equipment to create a systematic approach to backcountry travel that had kept him safe through hundreds of solo rides. One regular riding companion who occasionally accompanied Christopher on his longer expeditions was a fellow snowmobiler named Jake Martinez, who had moved to Alaska from Montana and was eager to learn the specialized techniques required for safe travel in the extreme conditions of the far north. Jake was in his late 20s, physically fit, and had extensive experience with cold weather survival and winter sports, but he lacked the specific knowledge of Alaskan winter conditions that could mean the difference between a successful ride and a deadly disaster. Christopher had been mentoring Jake for several months, gradually introducing him to more challenging routes and more remote destinations as his skills and confidence developed. Christopher had been planning a solo snowmobile expedition to check on a remote hunting cabin that he used during the fall hunting season, and that required winter maintenance to prevent damage from the extreme cold and heavy snow, loads that characterized interior Alaska winters. The cabin was located about 120 miles northeast of Fairbanks, accessible only by snowmobile during the winter months, and requiring a full day of riding across challenging terrain that included frozen rivers, steep mountain passes, and areas where avalanche danger made route selection critical for safe travel. Jake had asked to accompany Christopher on the maintenance trip, but Christopher preferred to ride alone when checking on his remote property, and promised to take Jake on a recreational ride to the same area later in the winter, when time constraints would not limit their ability to deal with any problems they might encounter. They agreed that Christopher would contact Jake by satellite phone when he reached the cabin, and again when he began his return journey to Fairbanks, providing a basic communication schedule that would allow Jake to alert authorities if Christopher failed to check in as planned. Christopher set out from Fairbanks on a clear Friday morning in early February when temperatures were hovering around minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to ensure solid trail conditions but not so cold as to create dangerous wind chill factors or equipment problems related to extreme cold. His plan was to spend the weekend at his remote cabin performing maintenance tasks, then return to Fairbanks on Monday evening with enough daylight remaining to complete the long journey safely. He carried tools, spare parts, and supplies needed for cabin maintenance, along with emergency survival gear and enough food and fuel for a week, in case weather conditions prevented his planned return schedule. The ride to Christopher's remote cabin normally took about 6 hours over terrain that he knew intimately from years of hunting trips and previous maintenance visits. The route included several challenging sections where river crossings and steep climbs required careful attention to snow conditions and weather factors, but Christopher had completed the journey dozens of times without serious problems. His snowmobile was a powerful Arctic Cat designed for long-distance backcountry travel, and he had invested considerable money in modifications and accessories that improved its reliability and performance in extreme conditions. Christopher's first scheduled check-in call came on Friday evening, right on schedule, reporting that he had reached his cabin safely and found it in good condition despite the harsh winter weather. He mentioned that snow loads on the roof were heavier than expected and would require additional work to remove safely, but he expected to complete all necessary maintenance tasks over the weekend and begin his return journey as planned on Monday morning. The call was brief and routine, with no indication of any problems or concerns about weather conditions or equipment performance. When Christopher failed to make his scheduled check-in call on Monday evening, Jake was not immediately concerned because satellite phone communication could be unreliable in the remote mountainous area where the cabin was located. Cell phone service was non-existent in the area, and satellite coverage could be blocked by terrain features or weather conditions that made communication impossible, even when equipment was functioning properly. Jake waited until Tuesday evening before contacting Alaska State Troopers to report Christopher as overdue and potentially missing. The search and rescue operation that followed was massive by Alaska standards, involving helicopter overflights, ground teams with tracking dogs, and coordination with other snowmobilers who knew the area and could provide insight into the routes Christopher was most likely to have used. But the vastness of interior Alaska and the severity of winter conditions made searching extremely difficult, and the teams had to cover hundreds of square miles of wilderness where a single snowmobile and rider could easily remain hidden beneath snowdrifts or in areas that were inaccessible to search aircraft. On the fourth day of the search operation, a helicopter crew spotted something unusual in a remote valley about 40 miles from Christopher's cabin. It was the wreckage of a snowmobile that appeared to have been involved in a catastrophic accident, with debris scattered over a wide area and no sign of the rider who had been operating the machine. The searchers landed and began examining the wreckage, hoping to find clues about what had happened and where Christopher might be located. What they found was deeply disturbing. Christopher's snowmobile had been completely destroyed, but not in a way that was consistent with any type of accident that searchers had seen before. The heavy steel frame was twisted and bent as if it had been subjected to forces far beyond what any impact with terrain features could produce. The engine had been torn from its mounts and thrown more than 50 feet from the main wreckage, while smaller components were scattered over an area that extended for hundreds of yards in all directions. Most unsettling of all, there was no sign of Christopher anywhere near the wreckage site. Experienced search and rescue personnel knew that snowmobile accidents typically left riders within a relatively small area around their disabled machines, either thrown clear during the initial impact or trapped beneath the wreckage. But despite extensive searching of the surrounding area with tracking dogs and metal detectors, no trace of Christopher was found. The investigators also discovered evidence at the crash site that defied easy explanation. The snow around the wreckage showed massive tracks that were unlike anything left by known wildlife in the area. The impressions were enormous, easily 3 times the size of the largest bear tracks, and showed a stride length that suggested something much taller and more powerful than any animal native to Alaska. Some of the tracks appeared to be from bare feet rather than paws, with clearly defined toe impressions and an arch structure that suggested a humanoid creature of incredible size and strength. Even more disturbing were the claw marks that were found on trees throughout the crash site. The gouges in the bark were made by something with claws longer and sharper than those of any known predator, and they extended to heights that were far beyond the reach of bears, wolves, or any other wildlife that might be present in the area. Some of the claw marks appeared fresh, suggesting that whatever had made them had been present at the site recently, possibly when Christopher's accident had occurred. The search for Christopher continued for 2 more weeks, with teams expanding their coverage area and using increasingly sophisticated detection equipment to locate any trace of the missing snowmobiler. Aircraft equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over hundreds of square miles, looking for heat signatures that might indicate a person in distress or evidence that had been missed during ground searches. Metal detectors were used to search for Christopher's keys, wallet, or other personal items that might provide clues about his location or what had happened to him. During the extended search operation, several search team members reported encounters that suggested something unusual was present in the area where Christopher had disappeared. Multiple teams heard sounds that did not match any known wildlife, including vocalizations that seemed almost human but were distorted and amplified beyond anything that could come from a person. One search team reported seeing a massive figure moving through the trees at a distance, but when they investigated the area, they found only more of the enormous tracks that had been discovered at the crash site. Local Alaska native elders, when quietly consulted about the disappearance and the strange evidence that had been found, spoke knowingly about ancient legends of creatures that lived in the deepest wilderness and guarded territories that humans were not meant to enter. According to their traditional stories, these beings were immensely powerful and would attack anyone who violated sacred boundaries or disturbed places that were protected by spiritual forces. The elders suggested that Christopher might have unknowingly entered an area that was forbidden to humans and had encountered guardians that were far more dangerous than any natural predator. The official search for Christopher was eventually suspended when no additional evidence was found and resources were needed for other emergencies. But Jake and several other snowmobilers continued private search efforts for months afterward. Their investigations uncovered additional disturbing evidence, including more locations where the massive tracks were found and areas where the forest showed signs of disturbance that suggested the passage of something much larger and more powerful than any known wildlife species. Jake eventually moved away from Alaska, claiming that the remote areas where he had enjoyed snowmobiling no longer felt safe after Christopher's disappearance, and the strange evidence that had been discovered during the search operation. Other snowmobilers quietly began avoiding the area where Christopher had vanished, and several riders reported abandoning planned trips when they encountered the massive tracks or heard the unusual vocalizations that search teams had described. For Jake, and the other snowmobilers who had known Christopher. His disappearance served as a stark reminder that Alaska's wilderness still harbored mysteries and dangers that existed beyond conventional understanding. The evidence found at the crash site suggested that Christopher had encountered something that was not documented by science.